as you do. And there's cotton candy and rides and all sorts of surprises down here. And balloons, too. All colors.
Do they float?
Oh, yes. They float, Georgie. They float. And when you're down here with me, you float too!
Every 27 years, a creepy clown comes back to a sleepy small town and terrorizes its citizens until a group of kids band together and finally decide to fight back. This week, we talk about Stephen King's It and all the different ways it's been shown both on television and in film. And, of course, the most recent one is the one, It Chapter 2, that I really enjoyed. And, certainly I look forward to talking about that. I think one of the things that maybe we can start off this time with is just talking about how the story has translated between film and television.
Yeah. I mean, this was one thing that was very obvious for me with these two, is that the original 1990 version was made for TV and has a very made for TV feel. It's almost like every 15, 20 minutes, there's this sort of melodramatic kind of moment. Someone will look sort of very scared at the camera or something will happen almost like a cliffhanger. And it's got a kind of a slightly more, well, obviously the production values aren't as high as a feature movie. But in a way, I kind of felt this was slightly disarming in a way, because Tim Curry's performance is so good as Pennywise and he's so creepy that it's kind of like you've got this really kind of creepy person who's kind of invaded a soap opera or something like that. That's this, which kind of made it kind of put me slightly on edge, actually. And I watched it years ago, but watching it then, or watching it again, but kind of in a 3-hour segment, it's really, there's something very slightly unnerving about Tim Curry's performance. And for me, it's very hard to top what he's done there.
Now, a lot of people have this kind of fear of clowns and stuff. I guess it's actually called cotrophobia, I think it is. Or chorophobia. I've kind of found them creepy in a way, but not like, I would say I'm like kind of ever been like afraid per se, stuff like that. Do you have any kind of thoughts around the kind of that fear of clowns themselves?
Fear of clowns? I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's just a very odd kind of fear, really, not something I'm thankfully too subject to. I mean, one thing I will say is that having watched 3 hours of the original 1990 version, plus I guess what is a total of 5 hours because I watched chapter 1 and chapter 2. Wow. I've almost had like a solid working day of killer clowns this week. I would have thought if it's going to come out, it would have come out in those 8 hours. But and also, well, one thing of that is talking of those 8 hours in chapter 2. I felt like I went through almost an hour of strobing lights. There is so much in chapter 2 that I really. My eyes were tired by the end of chapter 2, but yeah.
Yeah, there's been stuff that like lately I've seen that they have warnings because, certainly like the whole strobing thing does trigger folks with epileptic, seizures and, those kind of issues and stuff. So certainly I hope, I kind of went to one of those movies like without really knowing that and then, suffered some kind of, I haven't heard anything, to be honest, but I can just imagine though that like that would be effect.
Definitely chapter 2 will set it off because that's a 3-hour movie and there's a lot of strobing in that movie. That's all I can say to people as a warning, but yeah.
And then, I think, like kind of what you said about the kind of made for TV feel is definitely spot on because those kind of moments are definitely made for like kind of, because there was a time, kids, that we actually had like commercials being a thing and stuff. And that it wasn't something you could kind of fast forward through and you had to watch them. And so that was kind of like how a lot of the things made for television really had to have those kind of commercial breaks and stuff, which of course part of it is we don't think about it, but that's how, movies and shows like that got made is something had to pay the bills and stuff. So.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of those weird things. They often have this, you may not having not lived in those times, these sort of 15-minute, 20-minute sections of programs where you had to have kind of like dramatic peaks and troughs. It gives it a very different kind of flow from a movie. But yeah. I mean, speaking of which, obviously the most obvious thing is like the effects far cheaper, we'll say, on the 1990s version.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty much like an unfair contest between the two, because like the budgets you just can't compare the budgets. I mean, knowing what I know about like kind of television production, I just know that even like kind of the well-funded, like the Shoguns and the Winds of War productions and stuff like that, they just still didn't have nearly the production, the budgets that you have for these epic films nowadays. I mean, we're talking like, maybe like $1 million or so, or at the most a couple million, something like that. And that's like a really high-end budget for back then. And then, like kind of, we're talking like, into the tens of millions. It's just, apples and oranges and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, what I would say though is what I actually kind of liked about when you compare the two versions is that there was a very much more focus on telling the story in the TV version.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt like they got a bit lost in trying to do very over the top set pieces and make it almost like an action adventure movie at times with the movie versions, which really kind of dragged it out for me. And I felt like the TV version was much more focused in that respect. And also, I actually didn't like really the using the effects so heavily with the scenes with Pennywise, because for me, he's kind of quite a supernatural character in that he has in the 90s, in the 1990 version, he's quite illusory. He kind of appears in people, then he's gone. He's kind of behind your back, and then he's not there. But there's not like you can reach out and grab him too much. Whereas they brought in this kind of physicality with him, with the new remakes, where you can hit him with a baseball bat and do this. And for me, that's slightly less scary in a way. It's almost like it's better that he's kind of something that is in your mind rather than something that's physical.
I see.
Which I kind of preferred that as a take on it. And he's this mixture of this creature that can kind of, I mean, in the original, in the 1990 version, he's like a creature that can kind of project himself into your head somehow. Whereas he seems to be just like a weird warping killer clown in the remake. So I think I preferred the more kind of supernatural version. And it has it's probably more of a testament of the times, really. We probably wouldn't buy into a baddie that's a completely kind of supernatural thing where you had to all hold hands and believe to beat him, which is sort of what they had to do in the original. And there was some sort of, they had to believe that the silver was going to kind of hurt it. And there's a sort of an element of that in the remake, but it's like they're being chased around and they're hitting him with all sorts of things. For me, that was a bit, I just felt, especially in chapter 2, and I'm probably more biased towards the TV version as you are towards the movies, but for me, like, I actually really enjoyed the first part, and it was the first time I've seen it. I haven't seen it previously to this, and I did really enjoy it, but the second part really fell flat for me. It kind of, I started to feel like it was almost like watching Evil Dead at times. It was a bit sort of too comedic, weird people sort of scuttling around naked in the background and all that kind of stuff. It really didn't, it started to fall flat, and I actually got pretty bored about halfway through, because I was just going, okay, they're going to get chased around, and it didn't have enough kind of tension and terror. I think what was nice about the first part was that it had a good amount of tension, because you're really worried about the kids. It may just be more down to the fact that you're just generally more concerned about kids with a killer clown going into than you are with adults. But
like, I think another key difference is the fact that, like, you had a chapter 1, chapter 2 in the remake, and the original, it was kind of very much, a lot more woven tightly, where it was, a lot of back and forth and stuff. Because it starts off with the present, and things flash back, and whereas like kind of in the remake and stuff, they just started with the kids. They just started in like kind of the origin, so to speak, at least for the story, and then I think what's also interesting is like kind of where you had the things going back to the 60s for the kids and stuff, and it was of course you can't compare the times and stuff in some ways, whereas in the remake we would go back to the 80s, and so that's another kind of interesting key difference and stuff like that. And I think in some ways that's reflected in the way the kids behave in terms of just also the environment, like kind of in both cases, of course, what's I find that's constant, that's interesting, is that you still had the small town and how that was like central to everything. And that's one thing I think really reflects as well on how small towns, there's something about them that's kind of very timeless, and that that's one of the things I think both the series and the remake really carry across. And I think you mentioned it in the notes and stuff like that, but about this idea that small towns are just one of those places that like is a great setting for these horrors because of how it just really puts that danger front and center.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of reasons why this one works. Well, I mean, from what I read anyway, Stephen King actually likes to use small towns because somebody one of his friends joked to him, like, if a vampire just turned up in New York, he'd probably get hit by a cab and that would be the end of that, and everybody would just go on living their lives.
Right.
But, I mean, and that was the reason he sort of brought them back in Salem's Lot into a small town. And actually, if you think, there's this idea that in a small, remote town, suburb, there's more chance for something evil to take hold because it becomes more believable. And also, there's also the other element to that is that, and this is very true in it, is that the characters in it, specifically the children, are kind of trapped by circumstance. They've got to just move there. And a lot of them have abusive parents, or they're in situations they can't really control. So there's this idea of being sort of trapped remotely by the town, and also trapped by their circumstances as well, which was something I kind of found. The last one thing I wanted to mention about the difference between the structure of the movies and the TV is that one thing I really liked about the TV one is that you see the children's stories, and then what happens is you see them as an adult, and their reaction to being called, the amount of fear they feel as an adult actually heightens either your expectations or what you feel like those kids went through. And it kind of, if you noticed as you went through, it's almost like the experiences with Pennywise got worse and worse, and the reactions from the adults got worse and worse, to the point where you got Stan killing himself, and that's kind of like his right. It was so bad. So I thought that was very clever, and I'm sure that follows the book more closely. But obviously, I can understand why they couldn't do that with the movie, because you can't have all of those actors and you'd have to try and create a 4-hour movie and get that approved, and I'm sure the studios probably wouldn't go for that. But
I felt like out of the two, though, like there's been, of course, tons of adaptations of Stephen King books over the years. I feel like with both the series and the movie remake, they did a really good job overall. Like, in other words, there's a lot of Stephen King novels that just don't translate well to the big or small screen. And these both have like kind of, besides like kind of the being very kind of, I don't know about accurate, but like kind of true to the story, but they also convey a lot of the combination, like, there's the horror elements, but the other part that like we haven't really talked about yet, but I definitely want to, is, to me, like what I find interesting is the heart of the story is actually about childhood and growing up and the struggles of it. And that's something that like, I think both really carry that, like it's just so much in the DNA of it that it's like kind of, to me, it's almost like where that's the core story. And then the horror is actually just like what they're facing as part of growing up, like as if the horrors of childhood aren't, tough enough, I guess. They have this scary clown to deal with.
Well, that's the thing is, I mean, almost like some of their lives are almost as scary as like experiencing Pennywise. Like, and one of the, and there's quite a few differences as well. I mean, the bullies are, one thing I noticed was there's an emphasis on racism with the 60s versions of the bullies, and in kind of omitted or replaced with homophobia in the remakes.
Right.
That seems to be the way they tackle it. And I wonder if that's either just what their decision was there was like, yeah, we just don't want to kind of bring up racism in this movie, or is it just they made the conscious decision to sort of make them more sort of homophobic than racist in the remakes?
I mean, it does feel a little bit more contemporary in the sense that, like, probably in the 80s, we were still kind of like, you know, like the 80s was like the Cosby generation, right? You know, like kind of the most recent controversy and stuff like that. And I feel like that was like kind of where we were starting to kind of really come to better terms with racism. I'm trying to remember even when the Rodney King, I guess that was like after that, right? That was like the 90s thereabouts and stuff like that. But
it was about 93, I think, or 92.
Okay. So we were kind of like still, you know, we were coming out of the 70s and we were like kind of, you know, the 80s, like kind of, there was like, we had Cosby, we had more integration, and things were like kind of racial, tensions seem to be at least at a simmer, and like where there seems to be a little bit more kumbaya. But then, of course, you know, like kind of as we saw with, you know, kind of the whole Rodney King thing, so like that, things kind of just blew wide open, and that's like kind of it was like a feeling of like, well, we went 2 steps forward, but 3 steps back and stuff. So so I think that was like kind of maybe a little bit of what was reflected, you know, in the TV series, and then with the movie adaptation, the remake, we have. I don't know. There was some of it, like I mean, they did kind of like I don't know. They actually there was kind of as much of the thing with Mike. It seemed like there was some of the racism with Mike in the remake, but yeah, definitely, like you said, the focus was definitely shifted over to more homophobic. You know, with the Henry Bauer, stuff like that. So so I definitely can see that shift, like you're saying.
Yeah, it was just noticeable for me that like it was so blatantly omitted. And I can tell you, in 1990, people were racist. We weren't post-racism in 1990, so they're more of a modern kind of take on that. The other interesting sort of difference for me in terms of the parents and how they're dealt with is Beverly's father. Because the original, it seems like he's just like a bit of a bastard, really, and hits her and really very strict. But there is kind of an obvious kind of implied sexual undertone with the remake, which they never really go into detail. And I'm not even sure. The thing is, in the book, there is also a kind of an ambiguity because her mum is alive in the book, and she often suspects that the father is doing that. But I don't think it's actually even sort of specified in the book either. But it's a lot more heavily implied in the remake.
And I think that's also reflects the times and how in you know, during like kind of maybe like 1990 or something like that, you just really, I can't even think of many stories or many times that was really kind of, you know, dealt with openly. It was definitely a lot more stigma, a lot more like kind of you know, things whispered. Whereas you know, I think as a reflection of like kind of post 80s and, you know, more modern times, there's some discussion around it, but it's still it's still like a lot more just the kind of things that like you know, entertainment and the media, like they're uncomfortably, you know, recognize it exists, but like kind of they just would rather not talk about it, kind of thing and stuff.
Yeah, it was out of most people's kind of ideas of what was actually possible and things like this. Oh, most people thought Freddie Mercury was straight for a lot of the time in the 80s. But and so glaringly obvious now. But I mean, it's I mean, I think as well the other one that's really obvious to me that was quite funny was just how irresponsible the policemen were in Derry back in the 1960s. It's sort of, In the 80s, at least, the policemen seem to care what's going on, and they're like going, kids, right, let's just everyone get back in your houses. Whereas when they meet the policeman down in the Barrens, he goes, what are you guys doing down here? He's not concerned that the children are out there. There's a maniac killer on the loose killing children. It's just like, what are you building that dam over there for? You know, that's really going to mess up our water system. Just remember, just all stick together. You want to play out here, out with the maniacs, just stick together, you'll be all right. So, you know, so I was just quite hilariously irresponsible policeman back then, but yeah.
I think that also, like one of the things that's shifted over the years, like there was a movie, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, in / book, that where they kind of showed, that one really showed how like our attitudes have really changed around the, you know, identifying the fact that like, you know, you have like, you know, predators, right, and stuff. And I'm drawing a blank for, I'll have to kind of see if I can pick it up or everything. But meanwhile, you know, like kind of, I'd say that's one thing, like one of the series I've been watching more recently is Mindhunter. And that shows like the progression where the FBI, I think we've talked about this before on another episode, that, you know, between like the 70s into the 80s, there was definitely like kind of a recognition that like there's a new type of killer that like isn't motivated by passion or, you know, money and stuff, that it's, you know, something kind of inherently, you know, basically due to like, you know, psychopathy or, you know, so that they're, you know, something really inherently, whether you call it wrong or not, that like they're just, you know, it's another breed of killer or something like that. And I think we kind of see that like, you know, definitely between when the series was done and now, like kind of there's definitely a lot more awareness of it. You know, Megan's Law, things like that, that's kind of now a lot more not only discussed, but it's like kind of, you know, this awareness and like kind of a lot more fear for parents around like kind of these things that like just before, you know, again, like we talked about the small towns that like a lot of these killers, you know, could get around, you know, the small towns because it was just, you know, when you saw a small town, you just thought like, oh, that's not the thing that happens in our town. That was like kind of the very typical thought. Whereas nowadays people realize, oh crap, you know, that, you know, neighbor could very well be a serial killer or sexual predator. But then, you know, of course, with Megan's Law, we have like kind of the ability to kind of really see where they are and stuff, unlike before where they could have gone hidden for many years and gone on attacking and, you know, being a predator, you know, like a wolf among sheep, I guess, so to speak. And
certainly. And I think that's another interesting thing that's sort of done in this movie is this idea that the village or the town, is complicit in the murders. They all kind of know what's going on, and for the sake of what they think is the common good, they just sort of let it kind of carry on, but just try and, you know, stay out of its way, but don't really know how to tackle it properly. But it sort of draws a mirror with this sort of other sort of weird, quirky things that you find in small towns where people know something going on, and but they can't change it for whatever reason. So
and I kind of grew up in some different small towns, so I definitely saw that where there's something about like a small town where, unlike a city where you can easily be anonymous, there's small towns have like kind of people gossip, they talk, they whisper things and stuff, and you hear about things through the grapevine that, you know, it's like in a big city, you'd never have that kind of thing happen. You know, like people could do things very anonymously, whereas in a small town, people know. That's the simplest way to put it.
And these are actually kind of similar things that happen, you know, that go on in Old Boy. We've got similar things of the rumors about Beverly, the rumors about the sister, you know, and, you know, people forgetting what may have even transgressed years ago and then dealing with the coming of age thing. There's quite a few sort of similarities there now I think about it. But
let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat.
Quick question. Which Losers Club member do you most identify with?
Which one do I most identify with? It's a good question, that. I'll have to think about that one.
For me, it'd be Mike, because of how, you know, growing up as a minority, with, you know, mostly white friends and stuff like that, I just, you know, felt very much like, on the one hand, at ease, but there was I just definitely recognized that, like, I was different and stuff like that. I never felt it, but it was like kind of one of those things where it's just like one of those, there's something to that. And I can't really, it's really one of those things that like really is hard to put exactly into words as to how that is. And it's, again, like, it wasn't like something that like it was ever felt. It was just more like something that like where you just were always aware. You just kind of were always conscious of the fact that like you were the minority and stuff like that.
Yeah. I'd probably go for Richie, I'm guessing, because I was a bit of a class clown, maybe.
Okay.
And I'm not tragic enough to be Bill, and I'm not neurotic enough to be Eddie, and I'm not kind of religious enough to be Stan. So
at the same time, I feel like one of the things that really works for this, the Losers Club, is how even if you didn't identify exactly with any of the members, you felt like you knew like the other members. Like you can still remember like, you know, something about like each of them where there was somebody you knew like kind of growing up that had some qualities of the different members. So
yeah,
they always seemed like familiar, no matter like kind of whether you identify with the different ones or not. And so.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting mix of people they have in their Losers Club. It's you know, and I have to say, you know, you've got to give real full credit to the kids, both in the TV movie and the movie version. They did such a fantastic job. You know, without those kids' portrayals, you know, they're really. I mean, that's what's so glaring for me in the recent remake is that the ones with the adults, even though they're relatively good actors, you know, done some very good stuff. It really does. It's nowhere near as engaging as the first version with the kids, really, in my opinion, anyway. But
and I think the other part that you know we've kind of talked about before is how there's definitely this kind of connection to Stranger Things, which is like, you know, something that I think we're both fans of and stuff.
Yeah.
And you can see the inspiration. You can kind of see how, you know, the Losers Club now becomes this, you know, group of friends who plays D&D and has all these kind of crazy, you know, universe adventures and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of, it's interesting how they've even talked about it, that like there's clearly the strong inspiration drawn from Stephen King and stuff.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, Stranger Things is just a culmination of various 80s movies and a lot of Stephen King references all the way through it. Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. In fact, actually, one thing you may want to do if you're going to rewatch the TV movie of It, I would suggest afterwards you watch a series called Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, which was an English comedy show where this guy basically does. It's kind of like a mixtape of Stephen King movies, and so it's kind of set like, has kind of a feeling of a very cheap TV movie, but sort of punctuated with very cheap effects, and you know, there's just some great quotes. Like he's got Garth Marenghi is basically Stephen King, and he's sort of in it saying, you know, he has to play the lead character because he doesn't think anyone else can pull it off. And you know, he says, I'm one of the few authors who've actually written more books than they've read. And trying to do those things is a good line, but I kind of get that feeling from Stephen King because he's written so many books. But.
Yeah. I did want to say one more thing about you know, having these child actors and stuff. Like I said, they're so talented, and the actor who played Bill, like he like really, he was clear, like kind of, you know, like besides being the leader, he was like a star, like kind of just even at that point. Unfortunately, though, what we saw as well, like kind of is it's such you know, so typical of this story that like he I think it was like kind of barely 27 or something like that, or you know, like in 30 maybe, that he took his life and everything. And
oh, really?
Yeah. And so that's another kind of sad part about it, that like is these kids who have these early careers and they really struggle past that. Like they just kind of, I don't know, some reason or somehow they just, you know, like it's a rare case that like the rare instance where they go on to thrive as adult, you know, actors. And it's, yeah, so it's kind of one of those things that like I feel like is another kind of case of maybe art like kind of reflecting life in the sense of where there's something kind of tragic to these child actors, like kind of just, you know, really when they face the, you know, quote unquote real world, that like they just yeah, it just kind of really doesn't end, seems like.
Yeah, it is. It does make you wonder about the machinations of Hollywood when you see all these children that come out so sort of damaged as a result of being in TVs and movies. One thing they did, just leading me on to another theme, is this idea, of course, of the losers club, and they're all quite successful when they grow up.
Oh yeah,
with that's quite an interesting sort of theme, and quite a modern theme, I would say. And the nerds becoming the winners in the end is quite with the .com boom and stuff, that obviously became like a much more obvious kind of thing. But I'm guessing back when he wrote that, it wasn't quite such an obvious sort of idea. The other one that stuck out to me as well that was interesting was this idea of, and this is also raised in Karate Kid as well, or Cobra Kai, I should say, not Karate Kid. But Eddie, with his overprotective mother, he has these kind of fabricated allergies and asthma. And again, in kind of Cobra Kai, there's this idea that somehow, the asthma and allergies are kind of fabricated in a way as a sort of a psychological issue. Which I'm just curious to see just how, if we see more of that, or if there's going to be more serious research into this idea that, some of this may be fabricated or not. I'm sure a lot of it isn't, but it's one of those interesting things that's kind of obviously creeping into culture somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was around the 80s that like the whole, pharmacy kind of for like, things that like were non-physical started kind of really kicking in, right? Where, maybe it was part of even like kind of, the whole drug kind of culture, if you will. Like we had some of the drugs in the 70s, but then like it seemed like the 80s like was definitely really the heyday of like cocaine and kind of all these other kind of drugs and stuff like that. And it was around that time that like then things like when there's Prozac or just all these other kind of drugs that like for your non-physical kind of illnesses, like kind of your illnesses of the mind started to kind of really kick in. It seemed like around that time frame. I don't know if that has anything to kind of do with like kind of just overall like we started kind of basically solving a lot of our social woes with drugs just as much as like kind of any kind of physical ailments and stuff.
Yeah, maybe it was a big expansion in the pharmaceutical industry or something like that in the 80s.
Right. I mean, that's something that like I've heard before about. I think it's actually with the Bush administration, the W one, where there was something about like where with testing and research development was a lot stricter prior to him coming into office, and then a lot of that eased up, and they had this thing called the fast track and stuff like that.
Right.
So I haven't heard of anything kind of where it led specifically to more, drugs being kind of, being more prevalent, stuff like that. But overall, I'd say like, between like the 90s to now, it seems like definitely we have, the pharmaceutical industry has definitely just boomed, maybe almost exponentially, stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I would appeal for everything. Yeah. So yeah, I did some reading on the idea of it, and apparently, so Stephen King his car broke down, and he was walking in the rain, and he goes over. He was walking over a bridge in this rain, and he was thinking of the story of the three Billy Goats Gruff, and which has a troll under the bridge, and he started thinking, well, what if the troll was real? And then he started thinking of the bridge as a transition point between childhood and adulthood. And then he sort of thought about, well, if this was in a town, what would the bridge be? And he thought, well, the sewers. The sewers are an obvious sort of similar thing that you'd have in a town, which is hence why Pennywise lives in the sewers. And this actually kind of got me thinking. One thing that I think is actually really clever about the TV movie, and that it's more consistent with the book, is this idea of every drain and plug hole is a potential threat.
Yeah.
Like if you put your ear up to, there's a kind of a very childlike kind of curiosity and fear about that. Like you put your fear up to the drain, you might hear something scary, or if you look down a drain, there might be something scary.
Yeah.
I think that for me, that's kind of like where you introduce that everyday kind of horror that's really interesting for me. Trying to take the but also this idea of Pennywise being a troll is really interesting for me.
Yeah.
In some respects, I kind of feel like he's the archetype of he's the original internet troll. And he kind of
That's what I was thinking also.
Yeah, he appears out of nowhere, kind of makes fun of people, tries to sort of make them afraid and beat them down and until he eats them completely, you know. And it's that sort of really made me think, yeah, that's so. If we're saying that in Old Boy is kind of just like a really dark version of Back to the Future, that's our sound bite from that, then I would say my sound bite from Pennywise from it is that Pennywise is the original internet troll. And one thing I did, but the other difference that I really want to point out, which I think is really sort of obvious of the difference in times, is that in 1990 they kill Pennywise with they shoot the silver at him, and then they'll go and beat him up, and they go and take his heart out. And it's kind of a very hands-on way of killing him. Whereas in chapter 2, you know, they say, they come up with this weird thing of like, how do you? He's only as big as he is, and then they all kind of like start calling him out almost. It's kind of like call out culture. They start sort of bullying him and calling him names, so he physically becomes smaller, and then they just break his heart, which I thought was like, that's such a sort of indication of modern, you know, they may as well have just sort of like defriended him on Facebook or something. That's kind of what it felt like to me. It was like, that was such a sort of indication of the culture we live in right now. So that was, that made me laugh quite a lot.
The other thing too, like where you had like the Pennywise being like this spider that was like kind of an alien creature, but you never really kind of really saw like anything that kind of indicated that. Whereas in the remake in the movies, they made it very literal that he was an alien that kind of had landed on Earth and stuff, and you saw like kind of how the Indians like kind of, you know, had the ceremony around it, and Mike, you know, kind of ends up getting this relic and stuff like that. So like there was kind of where I guess in the modern version, like kind of we see more like this literal like kind of, you know, alien conspiracy thing and stuff like that, and whereas the original you just see like it was some kind of creature that like kind of just somehow and that one like you know, he was clearly this, you know, physical visceral spider where there's webs like kind of, you know, tying everybody, you know, up and stuff like that, whereas in the new one it was more like this kind of energy spider, I guess, and like kind of that he allowed him to kind of take different forms and that kind of thing. So
sorry, change of locale there due to dodgy Wi-Fi. So we were talking about how there's this difference between the physicality of Pennywise, or how he's represented in both versions. Like you were saying, he's an alien or it's very obvious that he's an alien in the remake, and in the new one he's and in the original he's more sort of a fantasy, kind of dark fantasy sort of character, is at least how I sort of interpret.
Right.
One thing I did thought I actually liked the way they had, you know, his line of you all float, we'll all, you know, everyone floats down here, and they actually had them all kind of floating in this vortex. I thought that was kind of a nice sort of visual touch to that in the remake. But the other thing I thought was really interesting, and I'm guessing this is closer to the book in the original, was this idea that the kids were down in the sewer, but the light was actually the thing that you were afraid of. Like there was, you know, his spider-like form, this light on its stomach, and it's kind of quite an interesting sort of turning horror genre on its head, in that you're afraid of the light rather than the darkness.
Yeah, that was interesting.
But yeah, that was to go on. Yeah.
The other thing I think is interesting is that we both came to the series from different, angles, so to speak, or different frames of reference. Like I saw the remake before I saw the originals, and you saw the originals before seeing, like kind of these movies and stuff. So so I feel like in some ways that biased me, as we've discussed, towards the remakes. Is kind of where I really like kind of love the production value, love like kind of what they did with the child actors and all that kind of stuff, and I feel like kind of like the series kind of just feels very dated, kind of in comparison and stuff like that. So
yeah,
so that's my bias and everything. Like, and I think saying which one is better is probably one of those apples and oranges thing and stuff. And so that's the part of me that I am more objectively able to kind of to see, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I would say for me, I actually watched it when it came out in 1990, and I'm trying to think how I must have been like 14 when that came out. So whilst I wasn't like overly scared by it, it was still pretty creepy. Right. And Tim Curry as Pennywise still kind of like it was a little bit creepy for me, even watching it now. And I was, and for me, it was just like the remake. I mean, it was well done, but I just didn't find, Skarsgård, a Swedish clown, just didn't really cut it for me. Didn't find that funny. Not funny. I mean, didn't find that scary. And also, there's a lot of sort of modern horror movie techniques, tropes, or something in there that I just kind of felt like I'd seen a lot of times, like musics that kind of gets detuned at the point when you're supposed to get scared, and things like characters changing speed, like he sort of all of a sudden sped up and very fast towards people. That I don't know, that kind of all hit all the Evil Dead comedic horror buttons for me, and it didn't really sort of work. Yeah, and there was the scares are kind of more just cuts to Pennywise and him appearing and disappearing. And for me, I kind of prefer that simpler approach. I actually find that slightly creepier. A bit like sort of in Halloween, similar kind of stuff. They do a lot of just cutting away and cutting back. So yeah, that and just the sort of the amount of CGI and things, I just kind of, I don't know what it is. It's not particularly frightening for me, CGI, for some reason. I can obviously see when it's there and not. So those were the things that really kind of, and then in chapter 2, it seemed they kind of amped that up even more. It was done quite sort of in a restrained way and quite well in part 1, I thought, and I actually really thought it was well done. And he did, all being, it's a kind of a bit like, trying to play Han Solo or something like that. When someone does such an iconic job, it's very hard to fill their shoes afterwards. But
I think also like that speaks to one idea that really, for me, like kind of is close to home, so to speak. How less is more, like in horror and stuff, and how it's, and for that matter, even other genres where it's not necessarily about just kind of pumping special effects. Certainly, we've seen that with like things like the prequels to the Star Wars trilogy and stuff like that, where just because you have bigger budgets and more special effects does not make a movie that's more engaging, that kind of makes things more that doesn't necessarily make it better. However, I think what does like kind of really works in horror is when you have the ability kind of for people to kind of really click with the actors, click with the characters and stuff, that like you feel like they're not only likable, but there's a sense of something's at stake, that you care about what's happening and stuff. And I think that's something that for me, like you said, in the first one, the chapter 1, they definitely did a great job at. And then, I have to admit, even for me, like, even though I'm biased towards the remake and everything like that, I can see, like, certainly how, like, we kind of were maybe going through the motions to a degree and stuff like that with the story, because of the fact that, like, we kind of know how in some ways some different things will play out and stuff like that. And this is me talking about, like, even before I saw the original. So I think that's the thing that, like, is like kind of regardless of the other things, you really gotta it's got to be about the story. It's got to be about like kind of caring about what happens in the story with the characters.
Yeah, and I would say the best part of it really is the story about the kids. You know, that's really the best part of the story anyway. Really, even in the remake, the second half of the film doesn't really work that well. I mean, it just kind of works better when you've got both the older and the young, and you're using it as flash forwards and flash backwards, because it just kind of ties it all together a bit more. But yeah, I felt like separating off the adult story really made it obvious how much of a weaker story it was compared to the kids one. But yeah.
So in terms of coming up, you know, like we've done quite a bit of horror and stuff like that. And this was, you know, these past few episodes have been really around the idea that we wanted to kind of have some things that were more Halloween themed for the Halloween, stuff like that. Any thoughts on like next movies that we want to cover for folks?
I suppose you do a Christmas movie when it gets close to Christmas. That would be a particularly torturous one or something. Actually, one that I did think about that's, I don't know if it's really, yeah, I suppose there was Lord of the Rings I was thinking about, but then it's kind of, one is animated, one is live action.
That's an interesting one, yeah.
It's kind of a rotoscope one. Another one is Total Recall. I thought that might be quite an interesting one to do. Yeah, and of course Ghostbusters.
Dive into Western, like you know, the True Grit was like kind of one that like really stood out.
Yeah, we did mention that before. Yeah, I quite enjoy taking a break from sci-fi and horror. Definitely horror. I've had weeks upon weeks of horror now. So,
I mean, you know, certainly there's a lot of what's called prime real estate there for remakes and the originals and stuff like that. And then Stephen King in himself carves out a huge swath just in the whole, you know, the whole discussion. I mean, we're going to be doing a bunch of different Stephen King.
Yeah, we could almost do like a solid year of Stephen King by itself, I think. But I mean, I do actually love the old Stephen King movies, especially from, you know, I love The Shining and Cujo and Carrie. And of course, Christine, you know, all such fantastic movies, actually.
I think like we can do one episode that like just basically compares and contrasts which Stephen King movie adaptations work best and versus the ones that kind of like really struggled and stuff. Yeah.
I'd be quite, to be honest, I'd be quite happy to watch them all again, really. But,
awesome. So yeah, we'll definitely you know, see which one we talk about next, and we'll let you guys know. So thanks for watching, and as always, be sure to subscribe, as they say.
Cool. Thanks very much. Bye.